Peter, are you back?
Peter.
You're muted, Peter.
There we go. I'm unmuted and I will start the webinar now.
Okay.
I'll go ahead with that. Okay.
Okay.
So, Rick, you are now, the registrants are coming in. You can see it at the bottom,
Right.
you can see the numbers coming in. So perhaps we can just wait a minute or two while those numbers come in. Do you see that at the bottom, Rick?
No, in fact, my screen is frozen. None of my controls works and I can't see anything at the bottom. This is a shame.
In that case, I would suggest you leave it and rejoin.
Okay. Okay. Okay.
So for those of you who are coming in, we have just started. We're having minor technical difficulties here, but John Snipper is here and I am here, Peter Larson. Jerry Wright is here. Jerry is going to be managing the Q&A session, and Rick Culler is now, you still there, Rick? Rick is now frozen. I still see his picture. Looks like we're going to be another 2 or 3 minutes before we start here. I don't understand why Rick is still there.
Well, my theory is, Peter, that computers are 95% science and 5% voodoo, and clearly we are in the voodoo sector.
Right. Okay. So we may have to go it solo without our moderator. We can't get Rick in, or Jerry will be pressed into service as moderator. So
at least as a timekeeper.
Well, I've got Rick's notes here.
Well, that's good.
Okay. Well, let's see here. I'm wondering, Peter, oh, there he comes.
There he is.
Oh,
Okay, Mr. Ambassador.
You're muted.
There we go.
Right.
And we're going, right.
So
We have 42 people registered, and Rick, over to you.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Palestinian right of return, a discussion. And welcome to this Palestinian right of return. My name is Rick Kohler, and I took part in a group visit to Israel and Palestine in late 2019, organized by Dr. Peter Larson, whose learning and retirement course I had taken at Carleton University a couple of years prior, that offered as its theme, Israel-Palestine, can it ever be solved? Before the pandemic, Peter had organized annual come and see tours to Israel and Palestine, and my interest piqued by the course I had enjoyed. I signed up in the company of my wife, Edwina. There were about 15 of us when we first met in Jerusalem. It felt a bit like the outset of the Canterbury Tales pilgrimage. We had retired folks from the law, from academe, from foreign affairs, from journalism, a former federal MP, and folks from private sector business backgrounds. We shared one thing, an abiding curiosity about the Holy Land and why Israel and Palestine continued to struggle towards finding a more stable relationship. Today, our panelists consist of Peter Larson, who, among other things, is the chair of the Ottawa Forum for Palestine and Israel, and John Snipper, a retired lawyer, mediator, and arbitrator, and fellow member of the 2019 Come and See tour. I propose leading off by asking the same question to each of our guests, thereby teasing a dialogue that may throw some complementary perspectives, some light on shared complementary perspectives. Then I'd like to open things up to a question period fellow participant in the 2019 Come and See tour, Gerald Wright, will supervise the question and answer period, drawing questions collected from the audience that have been submitted by using the question and answer icon at the bottom of your webinar screen. Please note, the chat function has either been disabled or we won't be using it. If any questions are to get through to our participants, please use the Q&A function. Somewhere around the halfway mark, we're aiming at making this from 3:30 to about 5:30 at the latest. Somewhere halfway at an appropriate time, I'll certainly call for a break to allow us all a chance to take a health break. And I just wanted to give you a heads up that that's coming. I should mention too that this is being recorded and it will be shared publicly as long as our participants agree to that. I think in principle they've agreed, but that's prior to the fact. We'll see if they still agree when this is concluded. Briefly, before diving into the questions and answers that I'll be putting to our panelists, I'd like to ask each Peter and John to briefly introduce themselves and to fit a little context around why they're here today. So, Peter, may I ask you to jump in and say a few words about what has brought you to this illustrious scene?
Thanks, Rick. And thanks to everybody for joining today. And thanks specifically to John for agreeing to do this. It's not very often you get an opportunity to have a serious and thoughtful discussion about this issue. And so I'm really pleased to be able to do so. I think the issue of the Palestinian right of return is the key issue in the Israel-Palestine conflict. It's the least understood and very little talked about in the West. And I think this is mainly because most of the trips that go there go to Israel and the West Bank, but don't really meet refugees. And so in our trip, for example, we just spent one evening having dinner at a refugee camp. So we didn't really investigate. And that's, I think, quite common for most trips. It's a huge emotional and practical issue for both Palestinians and Israelis. On the Israeli or Jewish or Zionist side, the very idea of the return of refugees is very threatening. It puts into question, even if a small percentage of refugees were to return to Israel, it would put in question the Jewish majority in Israel. So for most Israelis, the idea of refugee return is off the table. It's not even discussable. On the Palestinian side, it's emotional and big because it involves most people. More than half of the Palestinian population of 11 or 12 million people or so are refugees, and most of them live in the worst conditions. Think of the conditions in Gaza or Lebanon or whatever. So for them, it's a very practical issue, and it's also a very emotional issue as well. Now, I went to high school and public school with a number of Jews. I was dimly aware of the fact that the parents of one of my friends had come from, one of my Jewish friends, had come from Eastern Europe where something very bad had happened, but I wasn't curious enough as a young person to investigate. I didn't know very much about it, but it did give me a lifelong kind of interest in the situation of Jews, of Israel, and then a little bit later, by extension, of the whole Israel-Palestine issue. So after retirement, one of the first things I did was I found a trip to go and visit Israel-Palestine, a trip actually not totally dissimilar to the one that we took, the three of us, or the four of us, took together. And basically, before I went, I couldn't really understand why they couldn't just make peace. After all, it really seemed that the main issue was agreeing on a border. How could that be so difficult? The Jews lived here, the Palestinians lived there. Why in the world, separate states for separate people? Why couldn't they agree on a border? Did they really hate each other so much that they couldn't come to that agreement? But when I went there, of course, whenever you travel, things that you thought you knew are different when you go there. And there were two big discoveries for me when I went on my first trip. The first one but I just didn't really understand how oppressive the occupation was. I didn't really understand the mechanics of a coercive environment, of checkpoints, of walls, controls, and so on. That was a bit of a shock to me, although I knew a little bit about it. But the other big surprise to me was that it's not true that Jews live over here and Palestinians live over there. There's a lot of Palestinians who live in Israel and a lot of Israeli Jews who live in the West Bank. And then on subsequent trips, I became more aware of the refugee issue. And I visited refugee camps in the West Bank, in Gaza, in Lebanon, in Jordan. And little by little, I came to realize that ending the occupation, or even creating a Palestinian mini state in the West Bank, doesn't really resolve their problems at all. So that's why I think the right of return is such a key issue, and why I'm so happy to be talking about it today.
Thanks, Peter. John, could we ask you for you don't have to say the same things, but a similar introduction.
You're muted, John.
You're muted, John.
Well, thank you very much, Peter, for doing this and allowing me to share the podium with you. And of course, I thank Rick and Jerry for being so kind as to do the various functions they're doing, not necessarily a particularly enviable task, considering the subject matter. I myself am what I would call a secular Jew, and aside from one visit to Israel in 1973, had come to the conclusion a few years after following events that I, as a Canadian secular Jew, perhaps didn't have a lot culturally in common with my fellow Jews living in Israel, who struck me very much as a Mediterranean people, much in terms of their outdoor life, their attitudes about things, and my interest drifted. And only in 2019 did, although I'd had various discussions from time to time about Israel, needless to say, I hadn't inquired too much into anything, read some history, but not a lot. And Peter's invitation, I'd met Peter, had the pleasure of meeting him a number of years ago, and he finally persuaded me, and circumstances were such that I could attend on the 2019 journey to Palestine, Israel, and was very glad to have done so and to have met some very, very nice, charming, intelligent, inquiring people, of whom two, aside from Peter, are with us today. I came away, it was difficult as a Jew to see some of the things I saw, what was going on, hear what I heard. And I came back with a certain impression of what was going on, most of which I retain to this day. The opinion I left with, I retain. Not all of it, though. Subsequent to my return, I became engaged, oddly enough, with through very strange circumstances, with a West Bank, one of these evil West Bank settlers. And he brought to my attention some things that were never brought to my attention during the tour, and I knew very little about, so I had some wrong impressions. So I've done extensive reading to try and fill those lacuna in my knowledge. And I ultimately came to the conclusion, I did read about the right of return, although my basic instinct had been, as a result of the meeting somebody, one of Peter's events, a young Palestinian who told me he was a refugee. And when I questioned him, I was puzzled, since I don't even think his grandparents had lived in Palestine at the time of the Nakba independence of Israel, Nakba for the Palestinians, independence for the Israelis. So my instinct was this was a very peculiar situation to have a refugee living in Canada studying here. Parents lived here, I think, and yet he was a refugee. So I read up a lot more after I got back. We did see a bit. We did spend an evening, very sad evening, with a refugee lady, and clear circumstances. And she was living in the West Bank, And I think that was probably a zone, I think a zone C area, I assume, or zone A area in the West Bank. So I did a lot of research and what mess sort of going around, and I came to the conclusion that there was no legal right of return and no other particular reason for a right of return. I'm going to be saying a few things that may be difficult for some people to hear. And my attitude to this is I'm approaching it as I was when I was a lawyer. I represented from time to time people, say a company whose leadership I did not like, whose leader I didn't like, even some of their activities I didn't like. But when they hired me and I came to the conclusion that the accusation being made or whatever was unjust, I would perform my legal role and give them the best defense possible or whatever it may be. And that's what I'm going to be doing here. I'm going to be vigorously and even perhaps aggressively saying that there is no right of return that the Palestinians have or have even earned, and that that takes nothing away. And I hope you don't come away from these words thinking, oh, well, he's got no sympathy for their circumstances, that it's lip service he's paying, when he says, as I am saying now, that I have no use for a lot of the activity that the Israeli government and the IDF are doing on the West Bank. It's disturbing, it's upsetting, and it shouldn't be going on. But having said that, please bear that in mind when it comes to some of the things I'm going to say that you may find seem to be antithetical to that last remark, but that truly is my feeling and belief about what is going on.
John, thank you. That's a good heads up. And both of you have set the scene nicely. I'm going to proceed now to dive into the questions. We'll be rotating who gets asked a question first and then second. We don't have a lot of questions, but enough that we can elicit a lot of substance. I won't ask this question just yet, but these first two are relatively short. They lead up to the principal right of return question. But let me start first by addressing to you, John, a question that reads as follows. Did Jews have a right to come and live in Palestine before 1948? And if so, did their right to be there somehow give them rights superior to those living there at the time?
The latter question, it's quite simply no, in my opinion. That didn't give them any greater rights. Of course, there's two parts really to that. There is the pre-Balfour, there's the Turkish era during the Ottoman Empire that came to a rather abrupt end in I think it was 1917, late 1917, when the British troops invaded Palestine. And let's be clear, when I'm talking about Palestine at this point, pre-1947 for sure, Palestine encompassed Jordan, the West Bank, and Israel. And it was a fairly large area. So that in 1917, the British took over, and in I think it's the Treaty of San Remo, in 1917 as well, they had issued the Balfour, what became known as the Balfour Declaration, that promised the Jews a homeland, provided that, of course, it didn't in any way negatively impact or didn't derogate from the civil and religious rights of the inhabitants of the place. And that was the essence. That was the starting point for the Jews finally figuring they had a foot in the door. But before that, before the British took over, the Turks, the Jews who were living there, and in 1922, there were when the British really took over and did their first census, there were about 85,000 Jews living there, and there were approximately 660,000 Arab Palestinian and Arabs. And I say Arabs because what is forgotten is between 1900 and 1957, there was a significant influx of Arabs who along with Jews, into the area. It wasn't just Jews who came in. There was an influx of Arabs as well, perhaps anywhere from 50 to 100,000, who went and settled in Palestine from Egypt, Syria, and some surrounding states. So the Jews during the Turkish time were there more or less accepted, were there as of right, might not be the right description. They were there, they got there, and no one told them to leave. There were, however, there were restrictions on buying property, and from time to time, as a result of Palestinian pressure, they were trying to close the door to Jewish immigration. They were relatively unsuccessful, as Benny Morris, a very noted Israeli historian, points out. Jews had gotten used to bribing officials because they'd lived in those kinds of countries before they came to Israel. So they were there, 85,000. I mean, it's fair to say they had the right to be there. By 1947, there were 630,000 Jews. That's a considerable increase. And the British, living up to their famous reputation of being called perfidious Albion, after had this promise to let the Jews create a homeland, and that was understood by most as a nation in Palestine, proceeded as a result of Arab upset and Arab oil in the Suez Canal to start cracking down on Jewish immigration, and did considerably. So when you get to 1947, and there was no way I could find any figures on it, there's no question, a huge number, probably many hundreds of thousands of Jews were technically in Palestine illegally. The British had said, you're not allowed to come in. They refused to issue permits. You know what happened after the Second World War with the Exodus, etc. So the answer is yes and no. Hundreds of thousands were there because they were allowed to be there, and indeed they'd been promised that they could be there to create a nation. And some were there based on the promise, but they reneged on the promise.
Thanks, John. Thank you. Peter, may I put the same question to you? I'll repeat it, if not for anything else, the audience. Did Jews have a right to come and live in Palestine before 1948? And if so, did their right to be there somehow give them rights superior to those already there?
Peter, you're muted.
You're muted. You're muted, Peter.
Thank you. Thanks for the question. We should remember that there have been Jews living continuously. That area of the world has been inhabited for 50,000 people, various tribes and groups. There have been Jews there for at least 3,000 years. I don't know how many exactly, but certainly 3,000 years. And there are archaeological digs all over Israel, Palestine today, which find remnants of mikvahs or synagogues or whatever. As John said, in the early 1800s, after more than 4 centuries of Muslim Ottoman rule, it's estimated that about 9% in the area were still Christian, and about 1 or 2% were Jewish. You're talking about 1800. And later, at the time that the Ottomans were controlling the area, they forbade immigration from Europeans. But as the Ottoman Empire collapsed, the European nations started sending missionaries. The British sent missionaries, set up schools, went to Nazareth, Jerusalem. The Germans had a colony in Jerusalem. And Jews started to do what was called Aliyah, coming particularly from Eastern Europe. After 1919, as John mentioned, the Ottoman Empire collapsed completely, and the League of Nations allowed the newly created Arab nations to create their own states. So, for example, the states of Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Iraq were created, but Palestine was the exception, because the British decided and got the authority from the League of Nations to have a mandate, a kind of colony. It was a British, they called the British Mandate for Palestine. And by that time, the immigration from Europe had raised the Jewish population to somewhere around 7%, which I think kind of fits with John's totals, but maybe off by a couple percentage points, but same order of magnitude. With the mandate in hand, Britain then started to implement the Balfour Declaration, which John made reference to as well. That declaration said that Britain would look with favor on the creation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And it started to actively promote, encourage the immigration of European Jews to Palestine. So back to by 1947, that number had increased. John's right, there were times when there was intense immigration, times when Britain backed off for various geopolitical reasons. But by 1947, that is to say after 30 years, more or less, of British control, there were about 600,000 Jews in that area who made up about a third of the population. So still a minority, but substantial. So back to the question then, did these European Jews have the right to come and live in Palestine before 1948? Well, here's what Lord Balfour said. I'm quoting him. In Palestine, we do not propose to even go through the form of consulting the local inhabitants. We are committed to Zionism, and Zionism, be it right or wrong, good or bad, is rooted in present needs and a far profounder import than the desires and prejudices of the 700,000 Arabs who now inhabit that ancient land. He was the colonial secretary. He's clearly thought the Jews had the right to come. And does that mean that they had superior rights? Well, even to displace them? Well, Balfour and the Colonial Office clearly thought so. So did the Zionists. And to put it crudely, the needs of white people were more important than the desires and prejudices of brown ones. And of course, the Palestinians who lived there didn't agree. They saw it as European colonialism, a reflection of the British colonial mentality.
Thank you. We switch now to another question.
Just a minute, something happened to John here.
Are you still there, John?
There's another person, another.
Yes.
John,
okay.
You have an avatar on screen.
I've got another, yes, much better looking, I might say.
He's got help.
There's no
it's my partner. It's my partner, Linda. So
hi, Linda.
Rename her. Sorry, folks.
maybe she could just put down her video, and that won't be so distracting.
Yes, yeah. Take your video off.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. John, why do you think 725,000 Palestinians fled from 1947 to 1949? I
think, Peter, you have to step back to understand what the situation was like in 1947 and 1948 when this massive exodus occurred. What happened was this: the Jews that came between 1900 and 1947 had basically come to Israel because of the vicious anti-Semitism that had arisen in Europe, particularly Eastern Europe, particularly the Russian Empire, in the late 19th century, at the same time as there was this rise in Zionism. And it was a vicious kind of anti-Semitism. We know about Hitler's anti-Semitism and Germany's anti-Semitism. We know that there was a lot of anti-Semitism in France, of which probably the shining moment of that was the famous Dreyfus trial. There was anti-Semitism in Britain. So there was a lot of anti-Semitism. And it was, as I say, it was of a rather vicious, with all kinds of vicious allegations of conspiracies, world control, world domination, the famous blood libel, that Jews had a religious ceremony requiring the blood of non-Jews, etc. So it was a nasty business. And that's one of the main reasons, that was the reason that Zionism started, was to enable Jews to escape whatever country they were in. They were discriminated and worse, persecuted. So that's why they got there. What they found when they got there, particularly after 1920, was an equally bad situation with a lot of anti-Semitism. In fact, The lead anti-Semite happened to be the leader of the Palestinian people from 1920 to 1950. His name was Husseini, al-Husseini. He was appointed the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, ironically, by the Lord Herbert Samuel, who was appointed by Britain to go in. He happened to be Jewish. I don't know that he knew much about al-Husseini when he did it, but he did. But Husseini was a nasty anti-Semite, and it probably represents what happened in the Second World War. Husseini escaped from Palestine, finally made his way to Nazi Germany, met Hitler, and there he formed an agreement with Hitler that given the opportunity, the Palestinians, he and the Arabs, surrounding Arabs, would do to the Jews what Hitler was doing in Nazi Germany at the time. And that was his attitude. And he broadcast from Nazi Germany throughout the war in Arabic to Arab nations. And basically his closing byline was, kill Jews wherever you find them. So, and this was also, was going on beforehand. There were all kinds of troubles between Jews and Palestinians. It's the first actual Jew killed. As the start of the trouble was in 1905, there was the famous massacre in Hebron. The Jews all evacuated Hebron when the people rose against them and murdered them. And there were various, there was other, and there just isn't time to go into all the details. But basically, the general sentiment was that Jews were unwelcome, that it was the extreme chutzpah to come to a Muslim state, a Muslim Arab state, and try and think they could establish a Jewish state there. And anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism became completely intermingled. They were indistinguishable one from the other, and that's basically continued to this day, as I'll point out later on. But the preaching, as I say, of this anti-Semitism was quite common. The other institution or organization that was famous for its anti-Semitism was the Muslim Brotherhood, which became established in 1928 and had a huge influence on the Arab population there. And indeed, Hamas is considered a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. During that period, there were riots, lots of troubles between the Jews and the Arabs. It was clear that animosity was growing at a pace and what in 1937, the Peel commissioners came to the conclusion, for instance, that after listening to Arab leadership and having heard Arab mobs when there were riots and whatnot happening, came to the distinct conclusion that it was quite clear, and there was no bones about it, that the Arab leadership hated the Jews, hated the Zionists, and that the Arab population had bought into this narrative in terms of this hatred. So in 1940, so by 1947, we have a terrible situation in which we have two peoples, ironically, biblically, from the same mother and father, Ishmael and Isaac. We have these two peoples almost like Cain and Abel, the Cain and Abel story writ large, busy now hating each other and murdering each other. And at the opening of the 1947 war, what happened was it was made quite clear by the Palestinian leadership that the Jews were to be annihilated. There's several, I'm not going to read them to you, statement by their military leaders and by their political leaders, the religious leaders, that the point was to drive the Jews out. During the Arab Rebellion, the common street saying, the commanders said, it was British to the sea, Jews to the grave. So this was the atmosphere that the 1947-1948 war was living. There is the issue of what's called now ethnic cleansing, whether you call it that or population exchange or what have you. There's no question that there was two different views. Jewish allegation being that the Jews intended to ethnically cleanse Palestine. That's putting it, I'll take that as an assumption. That meant driving the Palestinians out of Palestine into their neighboring friendly Arab neighborhoods. And that's in effect what happened. And it happened with a lot of blood, with raping, with pillaging, with murdering, body mutilations. There were some very famous massacres on the Jewish side and on the Arab side. It was an awful war. But where the Arabs were going to annihilate the Jews, and the Jews had no friends around them, basically to succor them if they were losing, the Arab intentions were to annihilate the Jews. And there's a big difference between the two. And that made Jews' backs were to the wall. They were fighting for their lives, literally. And that explains why it was as bloody and nasty a war. That explains why the Jews had to felt they had to drive the Arabs out if they could, because they were living with terrible anti-Semites and leaders who were anti-Semites. And that was the result. 6,000 Jews died, 12,000 Arab died, and that small population, 1% of each population. So it was nasty, and that was why. And if you didn't understand the extent of Arab anti-Semitism, Palestinian anti-Semitism before the war, dating back to the 20s, what happened was the expulsion flamed the fires of anti-Semitism. They inflamed them, but they didn't start them. They were there long before the Jewish-Arab-Palestinian war started. Thank you.
Thank you, John. You'll note that I raised my fingers to indicate that you should try to wind down your question in a couple of minutes. This is for guideline, really, more than anything else. I'm going to ask Peter the same question, and then you'll both get an opportunity to respond to the response. There may be a right of return. Here's a right of response. Peter, may I ask you the same question? Why do you think 725,000 Palestinians fled from 1947 to 1949?
Sure. Well, let me just broaden the scope a little bit, if it's okay. Actually, the Palestinians started fleeing as early as 1936. You'll remember that when the British took over, the Palestinians didn't get their independence. The British had the mandate. They were going to create a Jewish homeland. No one used the word state, but everybody knew that's what it meant. And the Palestinians reacted by calling together a Palestinian Arab Congress in 1919 with representatives from all over Palestine. They wanted their independence just like Jordan and Iraq and Syria had it, but were denied it by the British. So at the beginning, the Palestinian resistance was against the British, and then subsequently to the British project of bringing in more Jews and turning their country into a Jewish homeland. They declared the mandate illegal. They called for a parliament based on one man, one vote. And Britain responded by banning the organization. Many of the leaders were arrested. And that set the initial response. And Britain responded, as has been very experienced in doing, putting down colonial resistance. The repression led to Palestinian resistance. Then there were general strikes, which were peaceful at first, but you got put down more. And the end of it, the first wave of exiles of Palestinians were the Palestinian political leadership, who were about 10% of Palestinian males were either killed or put in prison or exiled. Not a significant number of people going away, but a significant part of the leadership. Then as things developed, as European Jews became more numerous, and it became clearer and clearer that their project was to take over the country, the middle class started to become concerned. Those who had access to newspapers, to radio, to telegraph, they started to look for the exits. And there was a significant exodus of Palestinian intellectuals, teachers, lawyers, doctors, particularly those who had mobile property, those who had jewelry, who had bank accounts, who had things and they started moving out slowly to Damascus or to Beirut or whatever, as they saw the writing on the wall. Not totally dissimilar, I think, from the way that many Jews left Europe prior to the Holocaust. They could see the writing on the wall and thought it was time to move away. Then we come to the third wave of exodus, which is the big one, the Nakba that John has described fairly well. The UN decided to partition the state and give, as in the beginning, 55% of it to the Jews and leave 45% to the Arabs. And there's a lot of mythology about why the fighting began, who threw the first stones, and there had been a history of friction developing over the previous period as more Jews came, and they were Palestinians were finding themselves losing land. They were collecting unemployed in Haifa and in Jaffa and Lod and so on. But the issue is not so much who provoked the fighting, in my view. If you have to look at it from a strategic point of view, the Jews wanted a state of their own. And in 1947, they were only a third of the population. So they had, they needed to be in the majority. And there are only two ways of doing that. Either encourage, force, pressure the Palestinians to leave, or to bring in more immigrants. And of course, the Zionist leadership did both. So the expulsion of the Palestinians was not an avoidable accident. It had to happen in one way or the other. So militias then started going through the countryside, and there they met Palestinian peasants who are largely illiterate, didn't have access to radio, didn't have access to newspapers, didn't really understand where we're going, and furthermore, did not have any movable assets. All of their assets were fixed: a house, cows, sheep, the orchards. So they held on until the bitter end, and they didn't leave in general until either they were forced out at gunpoint, or as John mentioned, they heard about a massacre in the next town and thought the only thing they needed to do was to leave. But by the time the dust settled, Israel had declared its independence, May 15, 1948. And by that time, more than 400,000 Palestinians had been displaced, and they lost all the property that they had. The surrounding Arab countries then, once the British left, surrounding Arab countries then attacked, but they were clearly of no match for the Israeli forces, who were better organized, better equipped, and so on. Now, there are stories, I've heard stories of where the Arab leaders told the Palestinians, go away, we'll whip the Jews and you can come back. I have no doubt that that probably happened in some places. I'm instructed by Hurricane Hazel or Hurricane Katrina, people don't leave their houses easily. People don't leave their houses unless they're really, really scared. I think I've also heard stories where there were Jews who said to their Palestinian neighbors, just wait here, it won't be a problem, we're all going to be able to get along together. I think that probably happened as well. There were probably Jews who didn't go with the Zionist project, who were friends with Palestinians, but it was a political imperative of the Zionist leadership, and it's what was carried out. The creation of the Jewish state with a Jewish majority required the expulsion of the Palestinians. The Zionist leaders knew it, and their diaries now open to the public show that that was the case. So why did the Palestinians flee? Well, it depends on when and who they were, but nobody left because they liked the idea. That's it.
Okay. We could move on to the principal question, but you both are permitted, if you wish, to respond one to the other on this question. John Snipper, do you have anything to add to Peter's response to that question?
Yes, I do, and it's sort of supplements a bit of what Peter said. The classic case where it was the Arab leadership who encouraged their population to leave was Haifa. In Haifa, there was the Irgun and the Stern gang, who basically were the shock troops in Haifa, and they were a nasty bunch, and the Palestinians suffered terribly in the initial assault. A lot, mind you, half the population had already left by that time of Haifa on their own before the Jews arrived. There were about 70,000 Palestinians in Haifa who were gathered in the port with the leadership that was left, because Peter quite rightly points out the best part of Palestinian leadership jumped ship early on. They could see the writing on the wall during the Arab rebellion. A lot of them had left. They didn't like what was happening. So what happened was that 30,000, they were all amassed in the port, and the Haganah, taken over from their terrorist gangs, the Irgun and the Stern gang, and urged them, Palestinians, to stay. They were wanted, they were needed. The mayor of Haifa urged them to stay. The leaders who were there decided they had to get in touch with the Arab High Command. They tried to get in touch, they couldn't. And they made the decision, and everyone, the Jewish side was shocked by it, to leave. And they were helped out by and the Jews were disappointed. So that's an example of what Peter was talking about, a good example of what happened. What I didn't mention was, of course, and this is important to the understanding of the main question, is that the partition plan in November of 1947, after Britain had turned the whole mess over to the United Nations, was, of course, that there would be Palestine in one part and Israel in the other. And the Jews rejoiced. A half a loaf, unleavened as it might have been, was still better than no loaf at all. That wasn't the view of the Arabs and the Palestinians. It was all or nothing. This was in accord, as I said earlier on. It just wasn't in the Muslim lexicon to have a minority actually have its own self-governing position. So what happened was, as soon as that happened, Jews celebrated, they were willing to accept it. The Arabs said no, and it was the Arabs who attacked first, the Palestinians who started the war, and in 1948, as soon as the British left, the other Arab states invaded. And it's important to remember that in terms of the history, that the Jews were willing to take a half a loaf, and that just wasn't acceptable, and never was, in my opinion, never actually was acceptable to any of them. I just want to comment on one issue. After the horrible massacre at Deir Yassin, again, it was the Stern gang in conjunction with the Irgun that did the massacre. They figured there were about 110 killed. The Haganah apologized, leadership, the chief rabbinate of the Haganah apologized, as did the leaders of the Yeshuv, which was the Jewish organization. Ben Gurion made a public apology to the Jordanians. The Arabs had their revenge, and one of the nastiest massacre was on Mount Scopus, where they trapped doctors, nurses, and students going to the university on Mount Scopus and killed them all. There were 77 killed, some were burned alive at the time. That was, and remember Deir Yassin was yelled by the invaders. There was a second revenge as well, shortly after, in what is called the Etzion block, where Jews came out with a white flag and they were massacred. And there was 3 other blocks that they were about to be invaded. They were saved by the Jordanian army, saw what was going to happen to them, and actually ushered those, there was, I think, 200 or 300 Jews to safety. And that just, again, emphasizes the kind of war this was.
Right. Thanks, John. Peter, do you want to add an addendum to that, or response to that part of John's answer?
Yeah, thank you. I'd like just to comment a couple of things that John said. To speak to this half loaf notion, I think he's absolutely right. The Jewish leadership accepted the idea, although John will know that there was a variety of Jewish forces at work. The Irgun, for example, had the whole of the Mandate Palestine on its emblem. They were going for broke, so there were arguments within the Jewish community about how far to go. But I think Ben Gurion won that sort of, let's take what we can get, and this is enough. I think from the Palestinian point of view, it was the thin edge of the wedge. They were seeing it as a British engineered colonial venture, and they were resisting it. And in fact, if you look at our own colonial history, some people say, well, had the Palestinians signed an agreement then, maybe things would be better. Our colonial history is that agreements only last as long as the power relationships last, and as the power relationships change, those agreements get overthrown or reworded or whatever. So the native people who signed agreements with us at one point find that those agreements are not in fact being respected. So I don't know how things would have unfolded, whether things would have in fact been any different or any better. I put it to John that if I hear stories, and I have no way of verifying this, that there are many instances of Jews and Palestinian Jews and non-Jews getting along together pre-48. People say their grandmother had tea with so-and-so and so on. I don't know whether that's the case or not. I believe it probably was true in some cases and not in others. But I think, I put it to you that if Britain, instead of deciding to create a Jewish state in Palestine, if instead they decided they're going to create it in Kenya, and they told the Kenyans, we're going to take half of your country and we're going to give it to immigrant Jews, I think that the Jewish immigrants would have quickly found anti-Semitism where no anti-Semitism existed before. And they would have confounded anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, because from their point of view, Zionism and Judaism was the same thing. So I think you have to really think of this carefully. The Kenyans would have seen this as a colonial venture. And I think the Palestinians also saw it as a colonial venture. One last point very quickly, about this Husseini, the Grand Mufta who went to see Hitler, and apparently I think that's true. I think there are pictures of him talking. I think once again, from the early part of the Palestinian point of view, their enemy was Britain, and Germany was fighting Britain. So I don't particularly like this guy and so on, but I don't think that it's just all because he was sucked up with anti-Semitism. I think he had an idea that his enemy, Britain's enemy, was my friend. So leave it at that.
Rick, can I just say this to Peter, because this is part of the tragedy. There's a wonderful book written called The City of Oranges about Jaffa. And if you can get your hands on it, it's a wonderful, because it was about how before 1900, basically, and Arab nationalism sucked on the anti-Semitism sucker that was European nationalism and adopted it. The Jews and the Arabs got around, and the Turks, as long as the Jews behaved as second-class citizens and didn't make waves, and like the Christians, they were welcomed. Compared to what anti-Semitism was like in Europe before 1900 and after, the Turks and the Muslims and the Muslim Arabs were certainly tolerant, far more so than Christian Europe. So they were. That's part of the whole tragedy of this. And I agree, Peter. I have no doubt that nobody wanted a group of people. The natives here in Canada probably, if they'd known what was coming for them, would have never agreed, and of course didn't in some occasions. So that's part of the tragedy. For me, once Israel had established itself as a state and it was recognized in the United Nations, that was the great watershed in terms of it should have been accepted by the Arab community at that time. I can understand they fought against it, and you're right, anybody would have. But it was more than just, well, I've made my point. I think the anti-Semitism was embedded with Arab nationalism, and the Zionists Zionism inflamed, made the flames even burn brighter.
Well, let me thank you both for the fulsome answers so far. I, as moderator, and keeping my eye on the clock, and we're about halfway through from 3:30 to 5:30, and we're just on the lip of the principal question in this discussion. May I suggest that we take a brief break, health break? Let's make it, 8 to 10 minutes, and I'll meet you back at our screens in under 10 minutes. Is that okay?
Give us the time. We're watching our times on our, so
4:30.
4:30.
How about 4:30?
4:35?
Yes,
Okay.
at 4:35.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Aiming at around 15, 16, 17 minutes altogether. So here's the question. I'll put it to you, Peter, first. Peter, do you think that a right of return to live in Israel exists for the Palestinians who have refugee status under UNRWA?
Okay, I have one slide I'd like to show. One, I'd like to share screen now, John, John and Rick, and if I can. Here is a slide I want to show. And I'll do this from the beginning. So I want to approach this question in two different ways. So one is a legal way to approach it, and the other is an ethical or moral way to approach the question. I think personally that the answer is yes, they do have a right to return from both perspectives. But let me just come at the ethical question to begin with. I have met now, as I told you, a number of Palestinian refugees, and I put up 4 examples here on my slide. Rick, can you confirm that you can see the slide okay?
I can see the slide.
Okay, perfect. So they come from different areas. They're refugees. Nadal lives in the Farah refugee camp in the West Bank, the upper left-hand corner. Karama lives in Gaza, and in fact, she's an English teacher, and she's also my Arabic teacher. Walid, I think a number of you have met. He lives in Ottawa. John mentioned the thing about raising the issue about refugees living in Canada, and we'll deal with that in a second. And the bottom right-hand corner, George Baramki, who's 84. He lives in East Jerusalem, and he was born in West Jerusalem. So let me just tell you a bit more about each of these people, because I think it was Stalin that said 1 million deaths is a statistic, but 1 death is a tragedy or something. So I want to bring it down to quite fine level, and then use these as examples. Nadal's family comes from near Haifa. They were forced to flee in 1947-48. Eventually ended up in this refugee camp in the West Bank that some of you have visited. Very crowded conditions. It was his birthday actually 10 days ago. I phoned him and he told me that 30% of the people in that refugee camp had the COVID, and they're still waiting for Israel to allow COVID vaccines to come in. He's a tour guide, a hiker, and he would be very happy if he was able to lead the tours in Israel, but he can't. He's stuck in the West Bank. Karama, the young woman in the upper right, is my Arab teacher. Her parents came from a very small village within sight of Gaza. In fact, she told me that her friend, she can go up to the roof of a 7-story apartment building in Gaza, and with a friend and her grandfather, he can point out the farm that he used to work. And he was expelled from that farm and now lives in very cramped conditions in Gaza, where he has electricity 4 or 6 hours a day and really no future for his children. Walid, he lives in Ottawa. He is a Canadian citizen. He is a Canadian public servant, and his family originally came from Jaffa. Now, John asked the question is, why is he considered a refugee? Well, he's a refugee because his family was forced out of Jaffa, and they lost property in Jaffa. He doesn't get any benefits today from UNRWA, but he is in exactly the same position, I would argue, as many Jews who might live in Canada, whose family lost property in Germany and are still seeking reparations and return of property that was confiscated unfairly. Right of return means not only right of return physically to go there, but right of return of the property that was taken. And that's the situation for George Baramki. George now lives in East Jerusalem, but he originally, in 1947, he lived in a lovely house in West Jerusalem. He was expelled from it, and the day he and I visited that house, it's festooned with Israeli flags. The house was confiscated. He never got any money for it. George is allowed physically to return to the area, but not allowed to take the house. So all these people want their return. They think it's fair. Now, would they ask you, would you give me the right to return? What would you say? Would you say, well, I'm terribly sorry, but I know you lost your land or your house, but you see, we Europeans treated the Jews very badly, terribly. So we decided to give them a state. Unfortunately for you, it was your country that we decided to give to them. Of course, if you'd been Jewish, you wouldn't have had to leave. But because you were Muslim, or in the case of George Baramki in the bottom right corner, Christian, I'm afraid you're out of luck. You lost all your possessions and you can't go back. Now, when you put it that way, of course, it sounds ridiculous. I'm sure all of us agree in equality, human rights, and democracy. But if you deny these people their right to return, both to go back and to get reparations for what was taken from them, ask yourself what separates you from that racist statement from Lord Balfour, namely Zionism, be it right or wrong, is of far profounder import than the desires and prejudices of the 700,000 Arabs who live there. The argument that Palestinians don't have the right to return to their own lands is thoroughly rooted in racism. Now, that's my view on the moral and ethical argument. On the legal argument, I'd like to turn for just a second to two basic claims. The Palestinians lay their claim on two documents. One is UN Resolution 194, passed in 1948 by 35 against 15, that says in part that refugees who wish to return to their homes and live in peace with their neighbors should be permitted to do so at the earliest possible date. Israel has never found the earliest possible date. The second legal basis is the UN Declaration of the Rights of Man, passed in 1948. And it says, everyone, I'm quoting, has the right to leave any country, including his own, and to return to his country. So if you leave Canada, you leave Ottawa because there's a race riot around the corner, or because you think that the country's going to hell in a handcart because the Trudeau's a socialist, you leave for whatever reason, we do not have the country as a right to say, well, I'm sorry you've gone, you don't have a right to come back to Canada, and we're confiscating your property. We cannot do that. So under both those resolutions, the right to return is an individual right. Nadal or Walid or Karama or George can decide. Whether they'll want to take advantage of that right depends on the various options they have in front of them, and they'll make a decision based on what they think is the best for them. In practice, I think it's very unlikely that Walid would like to return to Israel. George would probably stay in East Jerusalem, but I'm sure he'd like to have physical compensation for the house that was taken from him. Nadal would like to go back. He'd like to be able to work and guide tours all over Israel and to get compensation for the family farm that was taken. And finally, Karama's told me she'd be happy to live in Gaza if they had secure employment and so on, but that's up to her to decide. So in my view, it's up to them to decide, not up to somebody else to decide if they're allowed to or not. That's it.
Thank you, Peter.
Okay.
May I ask you the same question, John? Do you think a right of return to live in Israel exists for the Palestinians who have refugee status under UNRWA?
No, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah.
No, they have, in my opinion, neither a legal right nor any moral imperative to return. Peter, I guess maybe a little misunderstanding. I thought we were not talking about the right to compensation, so I'm not going to deal with that, but it is part of Resolution 194. Let me deal with the easier part first, which is the legal right. And in fact, there's two very easy answers as a lawyer about international law. It's quite clear in the Charter of the United Nations that resolutions of the United Nations General Assembly have absolutely no binding effect as legal documents. They are not. All they are aspirational. That's very clear from the Charter and is understood by everyone as such. So resolution number 194 has no legal effect whatsoever, imposes no obligations. The Declaration of Human Rights, it's interesting. It was really the brainchild of Eleanor Roosevelt, a well-known name, and she was the one who mothered it through the United Nations. And she made a very famous speech where she made it clear that that document, like all other documents that come out of the General Assembly, was indeed aspirational. And she made it perfectly clear. I'm not going to waste time reading her speech, but you can find it easily enough if you Google it, that this document was not meant to be a legal obligation of any state. And those are the two easy answers. There's no way that either the right of return in 194, so stated, and it isn't a right of return, And the Declaration of Human Rights was nothing more than an aspirational thing. That doesn't make anybody particularly sympathetic, I understand, to the position of the Zionist state, the Jewish state. But we are talking about international law here. So keep that in mind. If you were accused of something and you weren't guilty of it, the fact that you may have been guilty of something else or your conduct wasn't very nice, you were charged with going through a red light, but you only went through an orange light, you'd be out fighting like heck, not have to pay the fine for going through a red light because you only went through an orange light, but you weren't. So that's sort of a silly analogy, but it gets the idea. So there's absolutely, I can assure you, and any international lawyer would make it quite clear that neither of those documents are legally binding. But I want to go on because I think it's far more important that this issue of whether there's any moral imperative that should compel the Israelis to let the Palestinians back in. Let me make it clear, I'm not talking about practical imperative. I'd be as delighted as anyone else to see the poorest of the poor in the miserable circumstances of the Lebanese camps be invited to go back to Israel. But Israel made it clear from the get-go, if anybody was going to come back, it would be with a peace agreement. It had to be a peace agreement. And the Arabs, unfortunately, have made it very difficult for themselves by calling it an inalienable right. And as Peter said, it's a right that's individual. Well, UNRWA has created 5.5 million, and there's probably more. So is Israel supposed to embark on a 100-year plan to negotiate with every one of these families? And indeed, the right of return has been the obstacle to peace, as close as it came in 80 and 86, because the Arab delegation, the Palestinian delegation, knew it could not negotiate away the right of return because all the Arabs thought it was individual to each of them under the law, that's what they were persuaded of, to negotiate their right back. So all that Arafat could ever do was insist that Israel recognized the right of return, and then it was up to the Arabs to negotiate either compensation or return. Israel had no legal obligation to do that, and it would refuse to do it, and any sensible state would. But let me get back to a main point. Whether it's moral or legal, there is no moral or legal law that requires any state which has had war made upon it. It wasn't a state, of course, when the Arabs declared war on Israel, the Palestinians, in 1947 and 1948. There's absolutely no obligation on any state to take back to it people it has expelled and who continue to proclaim their enmity for the state they're asking you to back into. And that's my point. And there's 4 points I'm going to make. If only I could find my notes, which I managed to have misplaced on a walkabout. Here they are. There's 4 basic reasons why there's no moral or ethical imperative, in my opinion. One has been the continuous preaching of hatred. We've already dealt with 497. It's gotten worse, believe it or not, since 1948. So there's a preaching of hatred of Jews and Zionists by Arab leadership. There are, of course, been more than words. There's been deeds in trying to destroy Israel. We know all about the intifadas. We know about the terrorists who have come in. There is the pay for slay attitude of the Palestinian Authority and Hamas. And there is finally, and this is the most appalling of all, is the hatred of Jews and the destruction of Israel that is now being taught in all Palestinian schools. And I'm going to deal with all 4 of those issues. I've already talked about the hatred pre-1947. I want to talk about what's happened since. If you think that I'm exaggerating or not telling you the real goods, I'd like you to go to the Palestinian Media Watch website, and you will see the depth of hatred that is being spewed out of the Palestinian Authority media to this very day. It's so bad, it's so pathological that I even read on that site a weather report. talking about snow in Jerusalem. That was the one benefit of the snow, is it covered up the disgusting filth and evil of the occupiers. This is a weather forecast. So I'm not talking here about light banter of an anti-Semitic nature. That the PA has explicitly promoted this notion. The Jewish threat to humanity will be stopped only by exterminating all Jews. One preacher stated, "These malignant Jewish genes and cursed characteristics continue in them. They transfer them from generation to generation." The religious instructor of Mohammed Abbas has said this: "The Palestine conflict with Israel is essentially Islam's historic conflict against Jews because they are Satan's ally, spreading evil and falsehood. Israel, because it's a Jewish state, is Satan's spawn." This kind of evil spewing has been all encapsulated in a book called Deception, put out by the Palestinian Media Watch. And Haaretz, the most Arab-friendly newspaper in Israel, says this of this book. It says, "It's difficult to believe that this material is the official television channel of the Palestinian Authority and the PLO, and not that of Hamas or Islamic Jihad. The book's findings in some cases trigger concern, in most nausea," and they're 100% right. I want to talk about the dedication of the destruction of Israel. We know the Hamas charter calls and advocates for the liberation of all Palestine and the Zionist enemy. The emblem of the Palestinian, the PLO, which still exists, I don't know if you can see this or not, it's pretty hard to see. It's a map of Israel that shows it as belonging to Palestine. There is the continuing, PA celebrations in 2020 of their first terror attack actually had a mock-up of an Israeli town, and in front of the cheering crowds poured gas on it. This was just last year, and burned it while the crowds sang and recited poetry that how they were going to destroy the Jews. Hamas Political Bureau member has stated, "We have come to tell the Zionist enemy to leave us, for the day of your slaughter, extermination, annihilation is near." That was on May 15th, 2019. I want to talk briefly about the pay for slay. That's where Palestinian Authority now pays 330 million US, 7% of its budget, to the families of their heroes, Jews called, the Palestinians called terrorists. And that was, the ICJ warned the Jewish, warned the Palestinian Authority that that may be indeed a war crime to continue doing that. The EU just said it would cut it off, but Abbas was insisted it was going to continue. And we have the hero worship of martyrs. The worst of the martyrs was, one of the worst is a female named Dalal Mughrabi, who's called the Mermaid. And 2020, in honor and celebration of her deed was to crawl ashore from the Mediterranean with a bunch of others, attack 2 buses of holiday goers on the coastal road, and slaughtered 33 of them, including 12 children. I think they were finally killed. And what happened was, in celebration of that great deed, they had a special athletic event held in the public schools in the Palestinian Authority territory, with a T-shirt with her name, and praising her and planting trees in her honor. So this is what this hero worship leads to. Going on to where are we here? I want to go on to the education. If I can just, sorry, I'm just finding it in here someplace.
John, may I interrupt just a sec? You're on a good roll here. Would you be comfortable if we pause your answer for a moment to give Peter an opportunity to respond, and then you could come back and pick up at education and comment on his response? Does that
You're the
sound okay?
chief. You're the
Okay.
chief.
All right. Hold that thought then. Education is the next item. And Peter, may I invite you to respond to John's commentary on the right of
Okay,
religion?
so I'm not addressing question 4 yet. I'm just responding to a couple of things that John said. Is that right, Rick?
Yeah.
Okay. John, we've had a couple of conversations about this privately, so what I'm going to say to you will not surprise you. I think this pay for slay idea, from the Palestinian point of view, anybody who opposes Israel is at great risk of being accused of being a terrorist. And when they are accused of terrorists, especially if they live and work in the West Bank, they get held under administrative detention, where there's a 99-point-something% conviction rate. They can be held without a habeas corpus, the kinds of things that you and a lawyer would be familiar with. And if the court convicts them, they or their family can have their house destroyed. So the Palestinian Authority pays people who have been convicted under by Israeli law, and Israel interprets that as a pay for slay, because they say these people are terrorists. Some of them may have killed Israelis. Many of them may not have killed. But I just think it's a bit of a stretch to say it's pay for slay. I think that is Israel's spin on it. So I don't really buy that argument. I do agree that there is a lot of anti-Israel, anti-Zionist, anti-Jewish statements, words. They make me feel very uncomfortable. I don't like it. I understand where it's coming from, and I think I understand why it's happening, but I don't condone it. I don't think it's helpful. I think it makes Jews in Israel fearful, and it makes Jews in America fearful. I don't think that's a good idea. But I also understand what has prompted it. And I think it also, particularly in the student milieu, I would say amongst 17-year-old Palestinian men who've been held up at a checkpoint, and who have seen their fathers beaten up, have been forced to pull down their pants to prove that they have no gun in their pocket. Every 17-year-old Palestinian man in the West Bank probably wishes if he could get a Palestinian or a Jewish soldier in a dark alley by himself, he'd probably be glad to do him in. By the time they're 35, they say this is not going to answer the question. So I really discount heavily the import of all the examples you gave. I don't think they're wrong. I'm sure they are real, but I think we have to understand this under a very coercive situation of occupation. It's not surprising that you'll have all kinds of people saying things that are quite exaggerated, and really, for people like you and me and Rick and so on, not really something you can support.
Thanks, Peter. And that's a good response. Back to you, John, to pick up at education.
Okay.
But let me just make an observation on timing. We have a number of questions that are racking up, and we want to give Gerald Wright the opportunity to put those questions to you. It's now just about 5 o'clock, and could I suggest that you try to wrap up your aggregate commentary in another 10 minutes together, if that's possible, so that we can leave time for Q&As.
I'll do my best, but this is, to me, a very important part of this whole discussion, because my point, and I made the point, what is happening in terms of young 17-year-olds, etc., I have no use for that unless there's some relates to security. Every nation has an obligation to keep its people secure, and so does the Israelis. And the second Intifada, as our guide said, on our tour, our Palestinian guide said, the second Intifada is a disaster for the Arabs, and what they had was as a result of that horrible second Intifada. But I want to deal with education, and it's education and hatred, and it's important. Anyone that's interested in this subject, I would highly recommend that you go to the site of IMPACT. It's IMPACT-SE, which researches Middle Eastern school textbooks, teachers' guides, and curricula to assess whether young people are being educated to accept others, to solve conflicts through negotiation and compromise while rejecting hatred and violence. That's all as per UNESCO standards. After the Oslo Accords, Palestinian Authority promised to completely redo their curriculum and presumably improve it and make it more friendly towards their neighbors, as unfortunate as those neighbors were. Here's the findings of that impact. And these findings were presented to the UN Committee on Anti-Discrimination, who have upbraided the Palestinians for this. They say, unfortunately, the main findings of the reports analyzing the new Palestinian curriculum shows them to be more radical than those previously published. There is a systemic insertion of violence, martyrdom, and jihad across all grades and subjects, embracing a full spectrum of extreme nationalist ideas and Islamic ideologies. Violent struggle for the liberation of Palestine in its entirety is propagated. The future of Palestinians in Israel proper, beyond the 1949 demarcation line, is dramatically increased in these new textbooks. A violent reference to the fate of Jews living in Israel appears in a poem which calls to annihilate the remnants of the foreigners after eliminating the usurper. Israel will become sovereign Palestinian territory. Jews in Israel are vilified. Anti-Semitism is more prevalent. Texts systematically characterize all things Israeli as nefarious. Jews in Israel are delegitimized and demonized to such a degree that one cannot perceive either as a partner for peaceful coexistence. What are the result of all this kind of stuff? Never mind the pay for slay, never mind the two intifadas and knifings and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Here's what it results in. It's the attitudes, and it's the attitudes of young people, and this is what's being preached. Palestine, a survey done by the Anti-Defamation League, they do it around the world every number of years, found that 87% of Palestinians believe people hate Jews because of the way Jews behave. Now, one could understand because of what the Israelis and the IDF are doing to the Palestinians, which I don't have any use for most of it. One could understand that they think that that must be the way Jews behave everywhere. The poll also found the Palestinians are anti-Semitic population in the world. The RAND Corporation, in fact, gathered information between 2018 and 2020 and found, this is the quote, the overwhelming priority in all discussions with Israeli Jews and with Palestinians was the desire to separate from the other and avoid any governance or living arrangement that brought the two groups closer together, the report explained. For Palestinians, it was unheard of. They said, they hate us, we hate them, how could we live together? And of course, as Peter says, look, it's understandable from what they see the IDF doing and what they hear from the Israeli government, that the flames of this anti-Semitism are going to be just simply grow higher. But all this is to this point, that we're talking about a moral imperative that the Palestinians could have a right to return to their homes. That's what they're talking about, to their homes and their lands. And my point is this, as I said before, no state would be ever required under any moral or other imperative to ever take back people who their leadership is teaching them this, and they're showing that they're imbibing of it because of the destruction. So my final point will be this, what people probably don't understand is this idea of ethnic cleansing or population exchanges was actually accepted as what was called customary international law back in the 40s and 50s. Think of the Germans, 10 million Germans were expelled from Europe after the Second World War, and they had lived for centuries in Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland. They were all expelled. They complained as well. And we have the Armenians who were thrown out of Turkey and massacred, the horrible genocide of the Armenians. We have the British imposing the population transfer in 1948, I think it was, on the Pakistanis, etc. The other thing to remember is this: when the Israelis are looking at, are these people we can let in? The Palestinians themselves, the Muslim Islamic world seems to want to settle its differences with bloodshed. They've done it in Iraq. You look at Iraq, you look at Syria, you look at Jordan, you look at Lebanon, you look at Saudi Arabia. Virtually every country you look at, there has been a lot of bloodshed. And the Palestinians themselves had a terrible civil war. When the Hamas won the election after 2006, the Hamas tried to, Palestinian Authority didn't recognize it. There was a bloody, hundreds of people, they were killing each other, and that's each other in 2006 because they didn't agree over the results of an election. So no responsible Israeli state on either legal or other grounds could possibly accede to any such thing as a right of return with this is what's going on from people who are who leadership certainly tells you are your sworn enemies and determined to destroy you. That's my point.
Thank you. Forcefully made. Peter, we're heading into our final 8 minutes or so.
Right, okay.
This would be your opportunity to respond, but also address if so, why, if not, why not?
Yeah, okay. Listen, I think where I wanted, John mentioned the Germans who were pushed out of Czechoslovakia. There were lots of people who were pushed around. Sometimes when I teach my course at the university, people say, well, what, my parents were kicked out of Russia, or my parents were kicked, why don't I have the right to return? What should you do? The Palestinians are the only major refugee group in the world that does not have the right to return. Now, there's some people who can't return because it's still a war-torn area or whatever, but I would support the right of anybody to return to where he came from. And furthermore, to get compensation, like I support the rights of Jews to get compensation if they can prove that their ancestors' property was sold in Germany or Poland or whatever. I want to, in my view, there are two main kinds of opposition to the right of return. One is John's, it's based on a fear of what would happen to Jews if the Palestinians had the right of return. And that fear, as I see it, has two different levels. One is immediately what would happen if 5 million Palestinians flooded over the border, bloodthirsty, revengeful Arabs wanted to slit the throats of Jews. So that's maybe a bit exaggerated, but that is a fear. But the other longer term fear is that if a significant number of Palestinian refugees were to return, eventually Israel would no longer have a Jewish majority. And therefore it would lose its ability to give privileges to Jews, and also it would lose its ability to be an insurance policy, a way to somehow back up Jews around the world in the event that there were another terrible outbreak of anti-Semitism in the same ilk as was experienced in the Holocaust. I think both those fears are understandable. And one of my frustrations with the Palestinians is that they're not saying, how would we deal with that? If we were to return, what protections are we going to give to Jews? What vision do we see for Jews in a new united Palestine? And the Palestinians still have trouble dealing with that. And until they do so, I think it's going to be very hard for them to get wide public support, because I'm not going to support a project where I think there is a real danger that the terrible things will happen to Jews. I will not do that. And I don't think most Canadians would either. I want to address a little bit the real politic argument. There are people who I talk to, I'm sure there are some who are watching this seminar tonight, who say, okay, I agree with the moral idea. I understand why Palestinians want and deserve the right to return. But frankly, it's not realistic. There's no way Israel's going to allow it to happen. Israel has an army, it has bombers, it has missiles, it has submarines, it has nuclear weapons. It's backed by the United States. Palestinians basically have nothing except for homemade weapons, or even the things that Hamas said that kill a small number of people from time to time. So why would you encourage an illusion? In fact, that's the argument of the Right of Return or the War of Return book, that by encouraging this illusion, you're just making the problem worse. That there's never going to be a solution. So stop putting forward this idea. And basically, I agree with the analysis. Israel is very strong. And furthermore, Israel is never going to admit the right of return and give up the idea of a Jewish society until it has to. But Israel may not be able to resist forever. In world politics, things change. Here, I think the example of South Africa is instructive. South Africa joined the UN in 1945. White society held blacks under an apartheid rule for 47 years. The whites were convinced that if they didn't do that, there would be a massacre, that the whites would be wiped out. South Africa had a huge military, was backed by the United States, and there was no way they were going to back down, the whites were going to back down, until a combination of internal pressure and external pressure forced them to do so. And external pressure was a key factor. Thanks in part to a very effective boycott campaign of South Africa, little by little, the Western public opinion started to change. And South Africa found itself more and more isolated, and America found it harder and harder to defend South Africa in world opinion. That's when the South African whites say, we've got to have another approach. Now, there's no reason in the world to believe that something similar might not happen to Israel. As everybody knows, there is a worldwide campaign called the BDS campaign, the boycott campaign against Israel, to bring pressure on Israel. It's gaining momentum. It is one of its demands is the right of return, which is one of the reasons why Israel is so worried about and annoyed over the BDS campaign. So if you have a very short-term horizon, if you're looking at the situation now, then there's every reason to be pessimistic. The Palestinians have no allies. They're outgunned, outmanned, and so on. There's no combination of forces that would force the Israelis to accept the right of return. But if you take a 40 or 50-year time frame, things change. The power of the US is declining. The ability of the US to defend Israel militarily and politically is declining. The right-wing trend inside Israel is making it harder and harder for progressive people around the world to support it. Black and brown and yellow countries are becoming more prominent. They don't have the Holocaust over the guilt over the Holocaust. They didn't do it. We still have guilt and should have guilt. They were not a part of this. They see this as an act of colonialism. So imagine just for a second, if you'd met an ANC representative 30 years ago and he said, I want to boycott South Africa, I want equality. Would you say, well, I'm sorry, South Africa's too strong. That's not realistic. You should just go for Bantustan. That would be a reasonable approach because it will never make it. Or would you have said, you're right, I support you. I want it to happen. And I will try to make Canada support that. Well, it's up to you. I think now today, most of us would have said that second is what we would have said. I hope that we would have said that at the time. So, of course, things look bleak for the Palestinians today. Wherever they turn, there's problems. There are few allies. I can't say forever, for sure, whether the Palestinians will ever get their right of return. They're certainly not going to get it in my lifetime. But that doesn't mean that I don't think it's a right thing to do. And I think I can make that more possible by speaking out and saying it should happen.
Peter, thank you. John, I know you'll want to respond, but may I just remind you, John, that we have questions and answers waiting, so try to be circumspect.
Well, I'll be as unlawyerly as possible in that case, Rick. I just wanted to say this to Peter. Peter, if you were right, I would have a right to make some kind of claim against Russia because one of my grandfather fled with the price on his head as a Jew and for other reasons, I gather, and right of return. There is one principle of international law that's common to all of us, and that any right you may have is only prospective. No law will ever give you a retroactive right. If you didn't have the right, and this is very germane to 1947 and 48 and the expulsion of the Palestinians, there was no, as I say, right of return. The reverse was true, that you didn't get a right of return. And one of the cardinal principles, of course, is that you only return with the blessing of the country you're returning to. Needless to say, in 1948, Israel was not a country, didn't exist. It didn't have the indications of the 4 indications of being a country until probably by mid-1949. So Palestinians were never citizens Israel itself. The other stuff, the other things you were dealing with, Peter, the practical and all the rest of it. And I should say, in terms of those 4 people that you put up on the screen, I'm sure they'd make wonderful citizens of Canada. The Israelis don't want to take a chance. As a Canadian, I'd be pleased to take a chance, and one is probably, and that does highlight one of what I think is the ridiculous notion allocated to Palestinians, is that you can have a Canadian Palestinian doctor as a resident here, his kids are born here, and he's got refugee status. And the last comment I'll make is the Palestinians got the grips on UNRWA, changed its basic policy, which is the policy of the United Nations Refugee, the Standard Refugee Committee, that you lose your refugee status once you're living someplace else and are established someplace else. The Palestinians have a very unique situation, and it's done for political reasons. And the United Nations is responsible, in my opinion, for all of the misery that in fact has been heaped on them. And it's their own leadership that has basically done it. The Jews, of course, have taken advantage of it at every turn, but the United Nations, by prolonging this misery and not doing what they did required of all other refugees and refugee countries like Lebanon, is to try to integrate the people that are refugees in your country, give them jobs, give them citizenship. Jordan did it, but of course, Jordan is really a Palestinian state in some respects. So there was, I'll say one last thing. The United Nations did set up a separate refugee agency for the North Koreans who fled to South Korea, but they hewed to the norm, which is to reintegrate, re-educate, and get people absorbed. So in 1950, when they established that commission, by 1957, it was gone, because all the North Koreans had integrated into South Korea. South Korea had accepted them all. If that had happened by the surrounding Arab states, the misery that is now suffered by the Palestinians wouldn't exist anymore. And Jordan is the example, because it did absorb, gave citizenship, it gave jobs to them, et cetera, et cetera. End of story.
John, thank you. Peter, thank you. We're going to turn to question and answers, but just let me say on behalf of the folks who have tuned in to watch, we are grateful for the good faith and integrity that you've brought to this discussion. It's clear that you've demonstrated with tremendous dexterity the complexities involved and why a simple, clear-cut answer has been so elusive. Now we're going to turn to questions and answers moderated by Jerry Wright. Of course, anyone in the audience can take off whenever they wish. That's the beauty of electronic media. But Jerry, if you have the time, would you lead them through the questions that are available, and folks can either stay or not stay according to how it develops. Over to you, Jerry.
Thanks, Rick. What a literate, informative discussion this has been. We've really got to send these 2 guys out on the road. They've done a fantastic job for us this evening. I've got a few questions, and I hope I would ask them to do one more thing for us, which is to give very short answers so we can get through them all. The first question is an excellent one about moral and legal rights, but I think that was covered pretty well in the second half of our meeting this afternoon. So I want to move to Jeffrey Wilkinson's question, which is, can you speak to what you think Israel would, and this probably should go to Peter, I think. Can you speak to what you think Israel would need to do in terms of acknowledgement of the wrongs of 1948 and 50 plus years of occupation that has had such devastating effects on the Palestinians? You think this acknowledgement needs to happen in order to engage in serious talk about the right of return? Peter?
Yes, in brief, I think that Israel needs to engage in something analogous to the truth and reconciliation process that we're doing in North America. We've just started it. It's very complex, it's emotional, it's difficult, but I think a lot of the pus in the wound that John is referring to would be taken out, starting with saying an acknowledgement, like Harper did in our Canadian Parliament or whatever, say, yes, okay, there are things that need to be rectified and we're willing to start doing so. And I think that should be a huge step forward. The actual mechanics of it will be very complicated. Some Palestinian, like George Baramki, the example I gave, his house is still sitting there. Somebody's in his house. It's got Israeli flags on it. He never got compensation. That's one. So another problem is somebody whose house is under Ben Gurion Airport. What are we going to do about that? So it's going to be a protracted process of figuring out exact. Not all Palestinians can return at once. There wouldn't be schools. There wouldn't be homes. There wouldn't be jobs. So the practicalities will have to be very negotiated in a practical sense. But it has to start with a recognition that, yes, what was done was wrong, and we did it because we were scared to death because of what had happened to us in Europe.
John, okay with you if we move to the next question? That's from Don Parkinson. John referenced Zionism fueling the flames of anti-Semitism pre-1948. In light of the current situation in Israel-Palestine, do you, Peter and John, think that the apparent rise of anti-Semitism now is being fueled by Zionism, along with the promotion of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism? John, why don't you take that?
Thanks, Don. I know the questioner. There's no question in my mind that there's a battle, a propaganda going battle, and it's heating up and it's getting even nastier than usual. So each side is using whatever armament they can muster, whether fairly or unfairly, in terms of this propaganda battle going over, which BDS is one and there's others. So I view the IHRA definition, which was never intended to be used as a definition of anti-Semitism. It was originally created for Jewish groups and others like them who were interested in identifying anti-Semitism as a tool, one of a number of tools to identify anti-Semitism. What happened is it has morphed into a kind of a definition itself, as if that was the definition, and it's got a lot of problems with it, in my opinion. On the other hand, we've got on the other side, of course, the BDS movement. My sympathies are in some respects with it in light of what's going on the West Bank, but because, unfortunately, it's tied itself to what my view is a non-starter as a right of return for, as I said, there's no moral imperative and there's absolutely no legal imperative. So it's, of course, waging a battle in campuses. There's a lot of ugliness, anti-Semitism going on campuses. And the Black Lives Matter movement has joined itself with the Palestinian movement, feel they're brothers in oppression, etc. There's this called intersectionality. So it's getting into a nasty business, and it's now turning out to be every side uses whatever weapons they may have. And those are the two demonstrations. But there's no question the Israeli treatment of West Bank and to some degree of their own citizens of Israel, their prejudice against them, is fueling anti-Semitism, as well as certainly anti-Zionism, but it's also fueling anti-Semitism because the two get confused by people. It's a Jewish state, so Jews are like that, and so it certainly hasn't helped. Certainly hasn't helped.
Peter, do you want to add anything?
No, it's fine.
Okay, then we can move to Craig Hunter's question. Craig is another former participant in the Come and See tours that Peter has run for a number of years. In any long-running conflict, both sides can always go back in history to find justification for their position. Would it not be better for the parties to spend more time looking at how to realistically get a good future and take some moral positions in looking to such a future? Peter?
Thanks a lot, Craig. Clearly, we have to go forward. Huh? But I think, to be fair, that very unlikely that Canadians would ever be able to reconcile with our Indigenous people if, for example, we had expelled 1 million Indigenous people from Saskatchewan and Alberta and Manitoba, and we were denying those people the right to return and killing them if they tried to return. We would not be able to sit down and have a civilized discussion about truth and reconciliation. So I think a starting point has to be grounded in what happened. And then you've got to move forward on a solution. But as long as Israel keeps denying or covering up or minimizing the Nakba, I don't think it's possible to move forward. And by the way, as a reciprocal true, I have come into some conversations with Palestinians who minimize the Holocaust. They say, oh, it's exaggerated. No, guys, you're not going to get anywhere. You have to recognize that Jews have a very good reason for being paranoid. They have been horribly treated in European countries for centuries. They have reasons to be fearful. We have to understand those reasons. We have to put forward a program that deals with those historic issues going forward.
If I may say, Jerry, in terms of it's, to me, there's no question, a truth and reconciliation thing would have to be part of any hope of any peaceful settlement, would be part of a peaceful settlement, but it's not all one way. It's not all Israel apologizing for the Nakba. It's also the Arab community apologizing for promoting anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, because that's at the heart of what the problem is, I think, Peter, is that the Palestinians have still not given up the hope of displacing the Jewish state. And that's quite clear. I mean, I've just read you some of it, but you go to these two websites and you'll see how clearly that is. So that until the Palestinians forthrightly in Arabic to their own people, as well as in English to all of the, what I tend to think of as gullible Westerners, make it plain and clear, yes, we give up all rights, we have no rights, we will hope you will negotiate some right of return of some Arabs. We recognize that you can be a Jewish state. And then when that happens, when that starts happening, there may be some hope of doing these kinds of things. And as I say, there was lots, the Arabs have to apologize, the intifadas, and so it's, both sides have blood on their hands. They have lots of blood on their hands, have a lot of guilt on their hands, have a lot of prejudice and hatred. And one would hope that a truth and reconciliation thing done for both sides, with both sides coming forward and saying mea culpa and listening to mea culpa from the other side, is going to be an essential element of any hope for any hope of peace. But I don't see much myself right now from either side. Either side. Israel's going to the right. The next election is just going to confirm that. Palestinians are getting more entrenched. They haven't changed at all. And that's where we are.
Paul and Louise Bard are also veterans of the Come and See tour, and they're both teachers, and no wonder they've asked a blockbuster question here. If we ever arrive to a two-state solution, would the right of Palestinians to return then be possible? Peter, could you give us
Sure. The two-state solution, which is normally thought of as some kind of modification of two states along the 67 borders with whatever changes and so on, does not address the issue of the refugees, because the refugees overwhelmingly come from what would be Israel in a two-state solution. So it doesn't deal with the question at all. The people who, that woman who lives in Gaza, who could see her father, whose friend's grandfather could see the farm over the hill, or Nadal, whose family came from Haifa, or George Baranti, whose house is in West Jerusalem, the two-state solution doesn't solve any of their problems. So the two-state solution might improve the situation about a quarter of the Palestinians, the ones who currently live in the West Bank, but it really doesn't address the issues of the others.
Well, Jerry, if
John?
I may, I would hope that, as I said before, part of any ultimate peace solution, that there would be some Palestinians, living in the most misery, would be able to return. We tend to forget that, of course, part of the right of the whole business of compensation gets wound up then with the Jewish claim that the 850,000 Jews who left the Arab states, some voluntarily, some not voluntarily, clearly that was wise for them to leave. If more Germans had realized, there would have been far fewer German victims, because at least the Jews in the Arab countries realized the writing was on the wall for them. So the compensation issue is much more complicated, but I would hope it would. I would foresee as any peace, any ultimate peace, Peter, that it's the transportation problems, the problems of, that we know about of marriage between different zones and not being able to live, that would be solved. They think that they could build a tunnel between Gaza and the West Bank so that security issues would be dealt with. So there are ways that this can be done, but the right of return, which is at the heart of it, it isn't. It's going to. Israel will never agree, obviously, and it's unlikely that there's a lot of Arabs, Palestinians, who would even want to live in a Jewish state. They wouldn't want that. So that would be a compensation issue of anything, and I would think compensation is probably doable, but boy, would that take a lot of. Could imagine that as a how many years that would take to negotiate. But if the leadership on both sides, if the current leadership all dies out, and somehow, notwithstanding the amount of hatred that young Jews in Israel and young Palestinians living in there can somehow have their minds changed about each other, then there might be a hope of having. But until that happens, there isn't much hope. People that hate each other will not create a peace. It's just not. And I come back to one point. The Middle East is a rough part of the world. The Arabs are not Danish Quakers, and the Jews aren't Swedish pacifists. The Jewish state is just like the Arab Muslim states now. It's bloody-minded, it's stubborn. You offend me, you're going to pay a price in spades. And that's the neighborhood it lives in, and that's why it's still around, because it's that tough. It's as tough as its neighbors. I'll say one thing for the Palestinians, they're in it for the long run. Peter, you made the point, and I agree with you. They're apparently, they're willing to suffer for hundreds of years and many, many generations, and they may ultimately win out. Who knows the course of history? 2,000 years ago, the Jews were all kicked out. They had reigned for 1,000 years. They were kicked out by the Romans and various others. So it certainly could happen again.
David Parnas asks, and I'm afraid, John, this is also directed to you. If we are to ignore UNGA UN General Assembly resolutions as aspirational, as you said, why should we not ignore the UN Partition Plan resolution?
Well, I'm sorry, why should we not ignore it?
Yes.
Well, the partition plan doesn't matter. It's history. The Arabs all voted against it, of course. You forget that the one section, the right of return, which was only should return, there was no obligation, and it was when practicable and peacefully, it had a condition of peace. The Arabs voted against it, and then the Palestinians and their supporters cherry-picked that one section out of the whole section, and the whole section was made as a framework for a peace plan. So there's no, I mean, I agree, there's the partition's irrelevant. That partition plan is completely irrelevant. It was never adopted, never acted on, and it was by force of arms that the Green Line was created, and that's the line that everybody talks about. And I just don't see, going back to 1948 certainly doesn't have the Palestinian cause, because there was no legal right and no moral suasion if you adopt the morality of 1948. It just didn't exist. Everybody was in fact doing population transfers, expelling troublesome ethnic groups. The best way to bring peace was by expelling them. And here, my motto is, there will be peace, but there will be no peace. If there is peace, it will not be peace with justice, not as far as the Palestinians are concerned.
Peter, do you want to add anything?
I could go on for several hours, but I think I'll.
Okay, well, thank you both for your succinct answers, and I should pass it now back to Rick.
Well,
Rick, can I say just one thing?
of course.
We didn't really get into the right of return in illegal. If there's any legal minds out there that actually has an interest in all the arguments on the legal issues, I found an article right exactly on point, written by a Fordham University international law professor, who deals with all of the points that have been raised over the years as to why there was a legal right of return, and in my view, dispatches them in amazing fashion. So if there's anyone, just get in touch with me and I'll be happy to send you the article. It's not available online.
Okay. John, thank you. I think the audience knows how to reach all of us. And if not, Peter Larson would be the right place to start. I'm not going to prolong this any further, because I think all of us have had a little over 2 hours of really divine discussion. And you've elucidated complexities, you've touched on sore points, you've exposed difficult dilemmas, and you've shown that much as the world and we want to find a solution or contribute to facilitating one, it's elusive. And you've really done us proud. On behalf of the audience, on behalf of Gerald Wright, thank you so much for giving of yourselves and sharing your experience and knowledge with us. On that note, I'll wrap it up and move that we adjourn.
Thank you very much, John. Thank
Everybody
Jerry.
keep well.
you. Okay. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thanks again,
Bye-bye.
Peter and Jerry.